Gentlemen, we are now live. So
They always coincide it with your tax return, don't they? Yeah.
right, we are now live on Facebook. So be careful what you say, who you say it to, and how you say it. Or don't. Have fun. What difference does it make? Radios. Okie dokie. We're going to get started in just a minute. We have got a we're going to be very heavy on rabbis today. Well, I don't need to apologize.
Not before time.
It's a very rabbinic heavy period that we are going to be going through. David's about to begin. Ian, thank you for the letter.
Pleasure.
I'll get that sorted. Ralph, what were you doing in shul though?
Jeremy didn't know how to tie down the canopy.
Ah.
I suggested some water butts. So I went on the internet and I found some barrels, which went out and got them in Hazel Grove, bought a couple of barrels, took them to shul, filled with water and tied the canopy down.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, I didn't know you'd done it. I just knew that.
What goes on, Rabbi?
No, I just got told that the nice people had been along. They didn't say it was you. Ah, very nice. A good boy. So wait a second. How deep are those water barrels?
How deep?
Yeah, the great big water barrels.
You couldn't swim in them.
I'm not talking about for me, I'm talking about for you.
I couldn't swim in them.
Not even you?
No.
Paddling them, Ralph.
Surprising how full, you still have how heavy they are. I got 60-litre ones. I could have got 30. Thought we'll get 60 just to make sure, because I wasn't sure how big the canopy was at the time.
They weigh a ton.
And you can't lift them. I mean,
no, you can't lift 60 litres of water. No way. Can't lift 60 litres. Are they big enough for us to try any witches we have to see if they're really witches?
If they're very short.
We can roll them down the stairs.
If they're very short.
They're very short. Radios. Okie dokie. Good afternoon, gentlemen. How are we all?
Good afternoon.
Oh, well, thank you.
Good afternoon.
David, I must apologize to you last night. And again, we were davening downstairs in the hall. There's no internet connection, so I couldn't get on Zoom. So looks like, and that looks like what we're doing at the moment, because it's the only place whereby we can have an indoor-outdoor setting as well.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, just let me know if you go upstairs again, won't you?
I will do, of course. Radios. Okay, so this week we are doing the 11th century, so from 1000 through to 1100. It's the movement from Babylon, Iraq, over to Europe. Although, as we will see, there's already been Jewish population in all of the areas we're going to speak about. We will briefly touch upon England because we have, for the first time, absolute evidence of Jews coming to live in England after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, although there were definitely, or not definitely, undoubtedly, there were Jews that were here already from the times of the Romans. They moved along like the rest of Jewry did after the destruction of the temple, following the trade routes, following it all along, and the Jews were living mainly in southern England, and they had more to do with France than they did with anywhere else, and their leaders were all French rabbis who were coming along. So we will touch a little bit on that there. We'll be looking at Jews within Spain, Italy, France and Germany, along the River Rhine. We will be going from Algeria to Morocco up to Spain as well, following one gentleman longer. We will look at lexicons and legal codes, which begin in this week. And we'll also have a few photos from my travels when I was in France, Germany a couple of years ago. So we'll get to this. And what a lexicon is, we'll get to that shortly.
Amen.
I do hope you've all got, did you all get your package with the coffee and smoked salmon sandwich? Did it all? I asked Ralph to deliver them all. Did you not deliver them?
We were waiting for you.
I ate them on the way. I'm sorry. I ate them on the way.
So let us just begin. We did mention them the other week, but the last two Gaonim, the last two leaders of the Jewish community in Bovel, a father and son duo, as often happens with Jewish history, at the end of any epoch, and then at the start of it, you have great leaders who epitomize everything that their era stood for. Bearing in mind that whenever we give these eras, these epochs, their names, that's post fact. We looked back on them. So now we look back and we say that from the 6th through to the 11th century, we've got the time of the Gaonim. The Talmud has been closed, the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud has been finished, and we've got the Gaonim. The Gaonim start to develop and progress this concept of writing questions and answers there and back, sending out edicts. They put together, we learned a couple of weeks ago, the first formulated aspect written down of a siddur, even though there was prayer much, much earlier on. And also they developed a little bit of language, which we see played itself out, as we learned the other week, in Spain. But the last two Gaonim, father and son, is Rav Sherira and Rav Hai Gon. Rav Sherira was probably born round about the year 900, so he was last week. He lived all the way through till the year 1003, according to some, even 1011. So he was 103 at the lowest, up to 111 when he passed away. Most do say, though, that it was probably around 103. So he's literally right at the very end. And his son, Rav Hai Gon, takes over in the year 998. So literally just before our period begins, on the Shabbos that the father handed over to the son, they read a special Haftarah. They changed the Haftarah in Shul, and instead they read the Haftarah which details Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, taking over from his father, King David HaMelech. According to someone else, Abu Dram, not only did they change the Haftarah, they actually changed the Maftir. So they had a second Sefer Torah that came out when they read the story of Moshe, asking Hashem to please find a successor for the Jewish people. We've come across the works of Rav Sherira Gaon a couple of times, mainly his letter that he wrote, which details the order of transmission of Jewish law from the time of Moses up until the time of the Gaonim. This was requested from the rabbis in Tehran, but we'll leave them alone for the moment because here they are ending and we have to move over to Europe. The first Rav we're going to be looking at in Europe is Reb Gershon Meor HaGaola, the light of the exile. But just before we get to Reb Gershon Meor HaGaola, who is born, Reb Gershon Meor HaGaola is born around 960 in Metz, France, and he comes to his main period in exactly the beginning of our century, in the year 1000. He puts together a number of edicts, but before we can get to there, we have to have a look at a little bit of history. Jews have been in Europe, in France, according to some, from the time of King Solomon. Now, the other week we had Rafi Berg speaking to us about the Red Sea spies, and he was looking at the Jews from Ethiopia. And there was a question, how did the Jews get to Ethiopia? We look at the Jews from Ethiopia as being different. They look to us as being the different and interlopers. And according to the Ethiopian tradition, not the Jewish Ethiopian tradition, but according to the non-Jewish Ethiopian tradition, they are there. They are all descended from the son of King Solomon. Shlomo HaMelech has a liaison with the queen of Ethiopia, and the son goes back to Ethiopia, according to their tradition, takes with him the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Ark from the temple, and so Jews have definitely moved around. But according to one version, the Jews also traveled to France at this time, but the only record we actually have comes from the time of Ezra. So after the destruction of the first temple, so 400 years after King Solomon, we are now in the 6th century BCE. So we're 1600 years before our time. We are 600 years before the rise of Christianity. We are 800 years before Europe even decides to pick up Christianity. Jews are already in Europe. So the next time you are told to go back where you come from, just remind your Anglo-Saxon, we were here first. We've been here for a long time. And there is a legend that states that Ezra when he's gathering the Jews back to Israel for the building of the second temple, he sends messages to Jews all around, including to the Jews of what we now know of as France. And they told them, we're settled here, we're all right. And when the Crusades come along at the beginning of the 11th century, well, the first Crusade happens in 1095. So when we have the Crusades, and we then have the destruction of the Rhineland Jewish communities, which will be in next week, and the destruction of the communities of Shum, of Speer, Worms, and Mainz, they attributed it to their arrogance when Ezra asked them to go back 1600 years beforehand, and they refused to go back. So we've got Jews living in Europe a long, long time previously. We know definitely at the destruction of the Second Temple, 1,000 years before our lecture today, Titus takes back with him thousands upon thousands of Jewish prisoners, slaves. We build the Colosseum, and within a very short period of time, these slaves all became emancipated, they became free people, and the Jewish community in Italy is established, well established, by the turn of the first millennium. So by the time you've got the first century in, we've already got a good Jewish community in Italy. Western Europe developed slightly differently within France and Germany, and the main one we've got is Charlemagne. Now, Ian already reminded us a couple of weeks ago, when the Muslims were coming over in the 8th century, we have at the Battle of Tours, they are stopped there in the year 732, and so Charles Martel stops the Muslim invasion going through, but we've got Christianity being involved, and you have Charlemagne. Now, we don't know, and by the way, does anybody know the relationship between Charlemagne and Charles Martel? Ian, do you know the relationship between? Pardon?
Brandy or champagne?
No, grandson.
Oh, grandson.
Charlemagne was Charles Martel's grandson, and he sets up the Holy Roman Empire, and according to him, either as him or even already his father, called Pepin the Short, Jews are invited to live within that area. Charlemagne, he's able to bring everyone together, and he really establishes that Jews should be living there, and you've got a lot of them. Jews come from Italy, the Balkans, Babylonia, and Asia Minor. How many Jews do we have living in Europe at this point? So there was a book written by a man by the name of H.J. Zimmels. He writes a book called Ashkenazim and Sephardim. It's written in 1958 here, in England, in London. And he puts together a table of the number of Ashkenazi versus Sephardi Jews in Europe at that point. He at 1170s when he's got his numbers from, so next week. But he says at that point there are only around 100,000 Ashkenazim Jews in Ashkenaz. We'll get the word Ashkenaz, by the way, is already mentioned in Bereshis. It does not mean Germany at all. It's not until our century that Ashkenaz gets associated with Germany. And when we refer to Ashkenaz, we mean Germany. When we use the term Ashkenazim to refer to anybody who's not Sephardim, we are just really belittling. But in order to give them their central names, there's about 100,000 Ashkenazi Jews in France, in Western Europe, excluding Spain, in 11th century, with 1.4 million Sephardi Jews, because they've all come across. Now, before we start to say who is better than others, and I know I often have a little bit of a laugh with my friend and colleague Rabbi Amir Elitov, who's the authentic Jews, the Ashkenazim or Sephardim? Scholars will tell you neither and both, because we trace the development of we learned last week about the four captives, where they came from. According to some, the Ashkenazim were the Sephardim who came in Spain, who followed along with the Muslim conquest, all came from Bovel. Hey, that's old. Where did the Ashkenazim come from? They came from Palestine, from Israel, even older than that. So to turn around and say, oh, well, you Ashkenazim, you all descended from the times of Christianity. You're all there from the rapes and pillaging of the Vikings and the Saxons. You're not actually real. Well, according to one, the Ashkenazim were those that came over from, as they write in their history books, Palestine, i.e. Israel, in the pre and post changing over from 1st, 2nd century BCE to 1st, 2nd century CE. And the Sephardim have only come from Babylon in the 7th and 8th centuries onwards. Others reverse it. Some say we're all from Israel. The Ashkenazim were from Jerusalem and south, and the Sephardim were based around the area of the Galil. But we both come from exactly the same place. We often look for divisions where divisions do not exist, although it's in this century and the next, in the 11th and 12th century, that we do have division from a halachic and a philosophical point of view, and within a very short period of time, that will separate into two separate branches. But unlike the separation when you've got with Christianity and everywhere else, it doesn't change into a different religion. Everyone holds exactly the same thing. And when Rabbi Yosef Karo puts his Shulchan Aruch together, he goes from a cross section from Ashkenazim and Sephardim in order to, but that's not until the 15th century. So we leave that alone for the moment. So you've got within Europe many Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Rabbeinu Gershon, Gershon Me'or Hagola, his main teacher is shrouded in a little bit of mystery. He's called Rabbi Yehuda Leontin, Rabbi Yehuda the Elder. I've Googled him, and you can never find more than 3 lines, even in the Oxford Dictionary, Oxford Reference Dictionary. There's not much about him, but what we do know, he was a halachist, he was a brilliant Talmudical scholar, and he also worked with the Christian community in Europe. He was able to bridge the gap between the two. He is visited by Rabbi Hai Gaon in Mainz. Rabbi Hai Gaon, the last Gaonim we know, travels over to Europe. He goes to Mainz. He goes along to the River Rhine, the border between France and Germany. It moves a lot in those days. And here we have our connection because he teaches Rabbi Gershon. So Rabbi Gershon's teacher communicated with Rav Hai Gaon. So the leader of Western European Jewry, his teacher was a bridge because he communicated and saw and learned together with Rav Hai Gaon back in the day. Now Rav Hai Gaon, Rabbi Gershon Meir, becomes the undisputed leader of Western European Jewry. And he's best known for a number of edicts that he makes. All of them come under the name of a cherem. What is a cherem? A cherem means to excommunicate. The threat, if you transgressed, you broke any one of these cherems, any one of these edicts, is that you put into a cherem, you put into excommunication. What were they? There are a number of them. There's the first one is the fact of that you have the law against polygamy. We'll get to the reasons why, but of the most famous ones, law against polygamy, until that time, well, it still is biblically permitted for a man to have more than one wife, to marry them both under a chuppah with kiddushin, to have a ksubah, and they have exactly the same rights. We're not talking about a concubine, a fully legitimate wife. It's still allowed, biblically speaking. And it sometimes still happens legally, halachically, and all allowed. We'll get to it shortly. The other one was that as a result of this, is that a wife has got to give her consent in order to receive a divorce. Number 3 is that anyone who has been forcibly converted, we are long before the time of the Spanish Inquisition, but we're right before the time of the Crusades, and we're very much at the time of the vitriol that is being spewed by Christians against Jews, and sometimes Jews are having to flee for their lives. His own son, Rabbi Gershon's own son, apostatizes. This was because the bishop of Mainz converted to become Jewish. His punishment was immediate burning at the stake. But as a revenge, they took on the Jews of Mainz that they killed exiled or had to be converted. And some of those who got caught up was Reb Gershon's own son, according to some, also a wife. He also had 2 wives, and one of them, some say that's the reason why he made the edict, but that seems to be a little bit of a legend, not necessarily grounded in facts. But his son apostatizes under pain. He never actually is able to escape, and when he does it, Reb Gershon sits shiva for 2 weeks, once physically and once spiritually, and that's the origin of when some say, if my child would, God forbid, marry out, I would sit shiva. He did it because his son actually baptized and was sprinkled, baptized as he apostatized and was baptized as a Roman Catholic. But his edict was that anyone that comes back and says, I renounce it, he's immediately accepted. It probably forms the basis of Kol Nidre, which, even though most Machzorim say the Kol Nidre was done by the Jews under the Spanish Inquisition, Nechtik and Tog, we've got evidence of it earlier, and the basis, the halachic basis of Kol Nidre, to allow us to daven with people who have apostatized, comes from the edict of Reb Gershon Melech Olam. And the 4th main one is the prohibition against opening up a letter that is addressed to somebody else. Now, why does he make these edicts? And why was the ban on polygamy never accepted within Sephardi Jewry? And it's, as I've mentioned before, it's not until 1948, when Israel comes into the legal state of Israel, the modern state comes into the legal existence, that they codify this as their law, and Sephardim have to accept it as well. All they had a problem, many of the Jews who were coming on all of the various operations from Iran, Iraq, Teman, and all Ethiopia, had multiple wives with them. And they had real problems in Israel. What do we do with it? Especially as this caused a division in society and a lot of racism, because, oh, well, they are, look at them, they're having multiple wives. And this was why Rabbeinu Gershon made his edict. In Judaism, marriage and intimacy is not just permitted, it's kosher, and it is the ultimate, the first mitzvah. Therefore, a man should leave his father and his mother, cleave to his wife, and become as one flesh. When you marry, when you have a child, you are a partner with God. It's not seen as something dirty, as it was in Christianity. And the Christians turn around to the Jews. Not only do they not have an aspect of celibacy, but they have multiple celibacy of not getting married at all. They have multiple wives. They are with, it was causing a chilul Hashem. And so Rabbeinu Gershon says, in order to stop this, we need to sort of normalize our relationships with them. So he made it as a cherem. For that reason, the Sephardim never had to do this, because in the Sephardi lands, in the Muslim countries, polygamy was the norm. In fact, I was reading once an account by a native African, and he describes growing up in a household, father and multiple mothers. And he says, you look at us, you ethnics look at us as being backwards. We look at you as being infantile. In my house, I've got a father and multiple mothers that everyone gets on with one another. There's no jealousy and there's no adultery. He says, look at you. You're so infantile, you can only cope with one wife. And even that one wife you don't cope with, and the rate of adultery is skyrocketing. So the Muslims society had, as Judaism, because why would Islam have changed it? They didn't change it from the original Jewish halacha. And so therefore, Sephardi countries never had to do it. The Ashkenazi countries, well, under the Christian ones, had this problem. Rabbeinu Gershon makes this edict. It gets, so because of that, there was now a problem with get, a divorce. Because you can no longer, previously, you could have another wife. Fine, if you want another one, get another wife. Don't have to divorce my first one. But now that you're not allowed to have 2 wives at the same time, if you want another wife, you have to divorce your first wife. According to biblical law, she doesn't need to give her consent. You give it to her. Rabbeinu Gershon made it that she has to give her consent to it. Previously, according to Biblical law, she just had to accept it. She actually has to give a full consent. And so therefore, if one of the ways of dealing with an aguna, and there are two types of aguna. There are three types of aguna: a recalcitrant husband, or the recalcitrant is one who refuses to accept or to give a get. Happens both ways. The man can refuse to give, the woman can refuse to accept. We often concentrate on the man, but the woman can refuse to accept as well and can cause just as much problems. And believe you me, I'm dealing with one at the moment where the woman is refusing to accept it. The man can't move on with his life. He wants to get married. We can't do a marriage for him because she refuses to accept the get. Now, because she has to accept it, you have circumstances whereby she can't. She may be in a coma, permanent vegetative state. She may have caught a disease and is no longer compos mentis. She doesn't have the ability to give informed consent. So in those circumstances, very, very limited circumstances, normally it happens when you've got a tragedy of a young couple, and I know of one case where after childbirth, she got septicemia, survived, but was in not a vegetative state, but was a child, no longer had the knowledge to be able to give informed consent. They couldn't continue living together. They got divorced and she was put into a home, properly looked after. But what was he supposed to do? He's 25 years old, young child, halachically married. So they lifted the edict. If you get heter merabon, if you have 100 rabbis say that this edict, it's not halach, it's an edict. This edict does not apply to you. They've removed that edict. You can still go according to biblical law. And I say in very, very limited circumstances, they allowed this to happen. And a man could have a second wife only when the wife was unable to give the get or accept the get, and the marriage couldn't continue because of, as I say, in that instance, it was a medical reason that she couldn't do it. The acceptance of conversion of apostates back in was an obvious issue that they were having to deal with. And the last one of not opening up the post. Christianity, up until the 8th century, viewed the Jews of Europe, other than in Italy. In Italy, the Jews were treated quite nicely. They were still under the papal edict. They were treated better. It wasn't a walk in the park. But the Jews were vermin. And we were reduced to begging. With the advance of Islam in the 8th century, even though it was halted, still Christianity had no access to the Far East. All of the lucrative trade routes were closed to them. The only people who were able to bridge the gap were the Jews. And so this is when you have the very lucrative, although despised concept of the Jewish peddler or the businessman. And there was one sentence that came across somewhere, I can't remember. Somebody actually wrote it, if Yosef in Mainz trusts his brother in Cordova, who trusts his cousin in Morocco, then trade can happen because they all trust. And how does that happen? Because you've got, they're communicating. There's no phones. They're communicating via letters. And in order to keep the trade routes open, these letters have to be sacrosanct. And it's interesting. We have evidence, any letter which was sealed with Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershon, it put on there, Cherem de Rabbeinu, never got opened. And other than the postman, they didn't touch it, because not only was Reb Gershon's edicts accepted by Jews, non-Jews accepted them as well. Because how else is society going to run? So the opening up of these trade routes and the commerce of everything being trusted was part of Reb Chaim Ber Gershon. And there is a Yiddish expression putting all of these together that goes, wie es kritzelt sich, also yidelt sich. How it goes in Christianity, so it goes in Judaism. So because Christianity couldn't have commerce. They needed the Jews, and so therefore the Jews had to. Therefore, Rabbeinu Gershon says, you've got to have these edicts. Because Christianity couldn't have polygamy, Jews had to show that they weren't a debased culture. They sort of not stepped up the mark, but they had to, in the words of Chief Rabbi Sachs, integrated without assimilating to make them to be known. Let's leave Rabbeinu Gershon alone for a moment, and we're going to go along to Italy. In Italy, we've got Rabbi Nosson ben Yechiel the Aroich. Let's make sure I get the right one over here. There's that many of them we've got, the Aroich. Rabbi Nosson ben Yechiel is born in Italy and dies in Rome and Italy. He's born there in 1035. He passes away in 1102. And what the Aroich, Rabbi Nosson ben Yechiel, does is he is a lexicographica. And most of what we know about him is from a short poem, which he adds, a cryptic poem, which he adds as an appendage to his masterpiece called the Aroich. What is the Aroich? The Aroich is when he takes all of the words within the Gemara and he compiles them together. Not a concordance, but a lexicograph, in order to explain the usage of these words. He earns his livelihood initially from selling shrouds. And 3 of his 4 sons die in early childhood, and he only has 1 surviving son. He is accepted by the members of the community as the leader of their community. He looks after their spiritual needs. In 1088, he builds a mikvah in Rome for everybody to use. And 1101, he writes the Aroch, which puts together all of the usage. And just a second, I'm just putting my notes on this one over here. So the problem with it is that he's putting together so many different building blocks in order to do it. He's using a multitude of languages. So he's quite a polyglot. He knows Aramaic, non-Jewish Aramaic dialects. He's very, very proficient when it comes to Arabic, Persian, but there's some Greek, there's Latin, there's some of the Slavic languages. Of course, he knows Italian very, very well. Now, what's interesting is that according to some, a lot of this, what he collected and collated from others. It's quoted by Rashi a number of times and becomes the way to unlock from a literary point of view the usage of the words within the Gemara. Steinsaltz, pass me that book there, please, man. Rabbi Adon Eben Yisrael Steinsaltz does a similar sort of thing on the side of his Gemara, when from time to time he will put, let's see, one of them he puts on here, language. So he's got here Abarta bar Hamog. So he goes, the word Abarta comes from the Persian word Abar, which means time, the herb time. So the Aroich is the first one to do this and to go through all of the words, because the Gemara itself is made up of Hebrew, Aramaic, but Aramaic comes from all over the place, and they've got to discuss the different, if you're speaking about different vessels, or you're talking about different foodstuffs, they've got to be able to understand them. So Reb Nosson ben Yechiel, living in Italy, does the first one of these, and it's the main one upon which everybody else bases their commentary on the Gemara. A word about the Jews of Italy is the fact that, as we said, Italy was definitely there from the time of the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. They have got a long and rich Jewish heritage. They do not follow the laws of either the Ashkenazim or the Sfardim. The nusach of davening is quite different. And let me just make sure we get the right one. Rabbeinu Tam, who we're going to get to next week, who's a grandson of Rashi, takes the pasuk Ki Mitzion Tetzes Torah, or Devar Hashem Yisrael, from out of Zion will go forth the Torah, and he changes it. Bearing in mind he's not Italian. Rabbeinu Tam is French-German, and he writes, he changes it from Barry will go forth Torah and the word of Hashem from Otranto. Does anybody know where Barry and Otranto are?
In
I-
Italy.
Of course, they're in Italy. Let me show you
On the
exactly.
East Coast.
Sorry?
The East Coast.
The East Coast radios. Let's show you exactly where they are. What am I going to do when Jonathan gets it? Is he right or wrong, boys?
I'm right.
You're right. Of course he's right. Here we've got Italy on the East Coast. You've got Barry and Otranto. And there's an interesting medrash with regards to Italy, saying that when King Solomon, Shlomo Melech, married an Egyptian princess, the angel planted a reed in Italy, planted a reed in the Mediterranean Sea, and from there grew the whole country of Italy, and it was never there before. But I know Chief Rabbi Sachs often says before Romulus was even being fed by wolves, Judaism already had a law of looking after each other and a sense of civil responsibility. So Italy's got their own Jewish community and their own tradition, and one of their most famous sons is the Aroich Rabbi Nosson ben Yechiel from the mid-11th century, who writes this lexicon of the writings within the Gemara. We've mentioned him a number of times, and I don't think we've got much time from this week, but Shmuel HaNagid in Muslim Spain from 993 to 1055, Shmuel HaNagid begins his life as a pauper, running a shop, not making much money out of it. But the reason we mentioned him a couple of weeks ago was because of his literary style. He was also a poet. So we mentioned him when we're looking at the development of the Hebrew language of Arabiya or Yedidia, whether you've got Arabic into Hebrew, Hebrew into Arabic, we mentioned him. But just because he lives in this time of year, he gains prominence because at one point, the Vizier Al-Arif is the Vizier of Granada. And when he's away, his chambermaid goes to Reb Shmuel HaNagid, asked him to write some letters. When Al-Arif comes back, he sees them, he says, whoa, this is brilliant. He employs him. When Al-Arif is dying, he's visited by King Chabus, whoever he is, who's impressed with Al-Arif. He says, hey, it wasn't even me. He gives credit to the Jew. He writes them all. Shmuel then gets hired by the king, and he rises up to great prominence when the king, and he gets called the Prince Shmuel HaNagid. And there's just one story I'd like to give it there. At one point, he was walking through the marketplace, and one of the shopkeepers hurled abuse at him. When the king's he was with the king, and the king said that Shmuel must make sure that the shopkeeper gets his tongue cut out. Instead of doing that, Shmuel sends the shopkeeper a handsome, lovely gift. Sometime later, they're walking through the marketplace again, and they go past his shop, and the shopkeeper comes out and heaps praise on the Ibn Nagdillah, which is the prince in Arabic. The king turns around to Shmuel and says to him, why didn't you do as I told you? He says, I did. I cut out his vicious tongue, and I gave him a nice, sweet-sounding tongue. So, but Shmuel HaNagid, he then, when the king dies, Shmuel does the right thing. He sides with the what's he called? With the son who becomes the heir, the younger son, and he puts his in the right one. Although unfortunately he passes away, say in 1055, his descendant, his son, has got to flee Cordova when he gets ransacked by the Berbers in 1066. But I want to leave them alone at the moment and drop down into Morocco and Algeria. We're going to a man by the name of what is known as the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchok Al-Fassi. Rabbi Yitzchok, the son of Yaakov HaKohen. He's called Al-Fassi because he ends up in Fez. He's born in Kila Hamad in Algeria. He moves along to Fez in Morocco, but then he has to go. He is tittle-tattled on by upset Jews, as always, and he's got to flee to Spain. What Rabbi Yitzchak Al-Fassi is famous for, and what you and I, all of us, has got to thank him for, is his codifying book that he writes. Yes, we've got lots of halachic books written beforehand, and we mentioned the other week the halachas. Pesukah is the first ones to actually write down sets of halachas. But what the Rif does is he takes the entire Talmud, removes all of the bits that Alan says what they're doing there, all of the stories of the medicines, all of the Agadata, all of the bits and pieces here, there, and everywhere, he takes out and just writes down the law, bit by bit, page by page. He spends 10 years in an attic writing it all by himself. Or was that the Aroich? It was either the Aroich or the Rif. One of them spent 10 years in an attic writing it all, writing their lifetime's work. And at the age of 75, as I said, he is slandered by members of the Jewish community. He has to run to Spain. He goes on to Cordova, but from Cordova, he moves to Lucena. And Lucena has already had a Jewish community there for over 200 years. And a couple of months later, in 1089, he is elected to be the Rav. He's born in 1013. So in the year of 1089, how old is he? 76 years old. He's elected to be their rabbi, and he takes upon himself to be the Rav of the community. We've got about 320 of his responsa, but he puts together halacha. Now, we have many other people that write halachic books. There's a man by the name of Ra'avad III. We'll get to him in a couple of weeks' time, who has got the sharpest tongue you have ever seen when it comes to speaking about his predecessors and what they have written. If you don't like them, he lets you know of it. He wrote, I would adhere to the words of the Rif, even if he decided that right was left. That was how clearly he wrote. He started in Algeria, moved to Morocco, went up to Spain, yet even the Ashkenazim accepted it. The Tosfos Rid, who we'll get to in 2 weeks' time, says it's impossible for a mortal to compose such a work unless the divine presence rests upon him. As we will learn in 5 weeks' time, when we get up to Rabbi Yosef Karo, who writes the Shulchan Aruch, he based himself on 3 halachic authorities. The first one is the Rif. The very first one who Rabbi Yosef Karo writes the Shulchan Aruch is on Rabbi Yitzchak ben Afas ben Yaakov, the Rif. He's the first one. He bases them. The other one is the Rambam with the Rosh. We'll get to in a couple of weeks' time. Next week we'll have the Rambam. In 2 weeks we'll have the Rosh. But the other thing that the Rif does is he moves the emphasis that you have in Spain. In generally, amongst the Sephardi Jews at that point, there was exclusive, they looked into philosophy. We've spoken about the poetry that they do, the secular intelligence that they like to look at, because they're going with the height of Muslim Spain. They're using all of the brilliance. Bear in mind, when if you're living under Christendom in Europe, it's the Dark Ages. If you're under Islam, it's the height of culture, of medicine, in philosophy, astrology, astronomy. They're loving it. And the Spanish scholars are diversifying. When the Rif comes along, he pulls them right back in again. Let's focus exclusively on halacha. For that reason, when Rambam once again goes into philosophy, next century, he gets into a little bit of trouble. Let's leave the Rif alone and go to our final one for today, and that is Rashi. None of you would be here without Rashi. Let's make sure I just get the right page over here. You mean there's that many we've written on here. Rashi. So Rashi is born in the year 1030 in the city of Troyes. Let's share the screen and show you the city of Troyes. Share there, move you out to the way. What's the matter? What's size? Is that not Troyes?
That's Italy.
Yes, I know. We'll have to move it along. I can't just jump like that. Now you can see Troyes. We are in France. Here is Troyes. All of these dots here are all areas of Ashkenazi scholarly centers from the 11th century onwards. You might recognize there's a map quite similar that was put together after the Holocaust, showing all of the areas of Jewish life in Poland. Here you've got scholarly areas, and you've got the River Rhine coming down, and we've got the three main communities of Metz or Mainz, nobody's really sure them, Worms and Speyer, which are the three spire, they're called Kehillah Shum. Shum is Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. Those communities. Rashi is born in Troyes in 1040. He's named Rashi because he's Rab Shlomo Yitzchaki, the son of Yitzchak. He traces his lineage back to the house of David HaMelech. Now, Rashi, the first thing that Rashi does is he wants to learn. Now, there are legends around his birth, the miracles that took place. Let's just show you another photo. Not this one here, but we need to go to here, and we need to go to this picture here. So, in this picture that you're seeing here, there is a sort of you can see a dent in the wall. According to legend, Rashi's mother was pregnant with him. Well, that's not legend. Rashi's mother was pregnant with him. According to legend, during her pregnancy, she was walking down this street and a horse and cart went out of control and would have knocked her. She leaned against the wall and it shrunk back in order to allow her to sort of face away back from the wall from the oncoming carriage, and her son's life was spared. This is the shul, the original Rashi shul. Now, when I say original, it was destroyed a number of times and rebuilt. Here I am in the shul of Rashi. Obviously, it's been rebuilt. It was destroyed a number of times, and again during the Second World War. But this is the seat which supposedly Rashi sat on. The building was destroyed, but this is a stone seat that was rare from 1,000 years ago. Now, Rashi but when I say all of these miracles around him pale into comparison with what Rashi did as an individual. Rashi does not mind saying, I do not know. In its commentary, he'll write, I don't know. He doesn't mind saying, Libi oimeli, my heart tells me. So he's got no proof of it, but his heart, he feels this to be right. He hardly ever argues or criticizes. He will state another opinion. Yeshemim, v'yeshemim. He will give another, those say and these say. He won't castigate others. He's living in a time of terrible poverty and also of persecution and of apostatizing. He doesn't criticize anyone. His first thing that we know Rashi on the Chumash, but the first thing that he actually writes was on the Gemara. Let's just understand what happened in those days. When you went along to study, there were two terms within yeshiva, 5 months. So from Cheshvan through to Pesach, and then after Pesach, you went back for another 5 months. So you had off for Tishrei and you had off for Nisan. They had 2 5-month semesters. When you went there each semester, you learned another tractate of the Gemara. There is no printing press. Each student would write down by hand the tractate that they were learning that year before they learned it. So your first few weeks was writing out your Gemara. So Alan was there, there's like, I must go to North Manchester, I must borrow a book. You can't go and borrow one from the shul or buy one in North Manchester. You need to sit and learn. You take a pen and a paper, a quill and paper, and you write down the text, then you learn it. Wealthy students, of course, got the poor kids. So, you would have the Eton kids would have gotten the boarding school children to write it out for them. So you have your Gemara. On the side, you would write your notes, your own notes, your teacher's notes, or if you'd inherited them from an older student, you would take those. And over generations, there's a whole compendium of knowledge, and they are called the kuntras, which means a compilation of Mainz. And we have some of those left behind. When Rashi goes together, he starts to sift through all of these, collating them, editing them, refining them, and changing them. And the first one of those that he records them, that becomes the first one. And straight away, those are known as the Vikuntras. Even though before you've got the Kuntras is a compilation of everyone, Rashi is now, when you speak about the Kuntras of compilation, it's just Rashi's works. By 1075, Rashi was born in 1040. He's 35 years old. By 1075, if you are in any of those Talmudical circles that we showed earlier on across France, you wanted to have your commentary on the Talmud, you picked up his. He writes, he edits it. He has, he goes back to Troyes. He's gone to Mainz. He goes back to Troyes and he writes a second one. And the one that we have in our Gemara now is, best as far as I know, it is the third one. Is when he revises it again. But the third one, yes, we have most of it he's got from the third edition. Some of what we have in the Gemara is either of Rashi's second or of his students' compilation for the third one. But you cannot open up the Gemara without Rashi. Rashi is able to get to the hub of it, to the nub of the point within the Gemara. And it doesn't matter whether you're a 5-year-old for the first time or you are a big scholar. Because what Rashi also does is he writes a commentary, his Rashi, on the Chumash. And now Chumash Rashi, that is the basic, that's the standard. Kizdin, Chumash Rashi. He also writes on Nevi'im, on prophets, although then it's not as widely written and there's a lot more commentary on the Nevi'im than on the Chumash, but he over and above Rashi's. But in the Chumash, it is his main one. If you're a 5-year-old student, you need Rashi just to tell you basics. And Rashi says at the beginning, I've only come to give the simple explanation. If you're a scholar, you can open up the same Rashi and find an amazing amount within there. So after his mother passed away, the Lubavitcher Rebbe spent a year giving Rashi, his weekly shir, his weekly sikha was Rashi. And he would take a Rashi, and we did the other week, we learned this Rashi. I was doing it with some colleagues in North Manchester. We'd done that Rashi earlier on in the day. Fine, Rashi, just explaining what happens over here. The Rebbe, which is just an explanation of the Pasuk. The Rebbe takes this Rashi and says, why has he used his opening statement? He's used 3 words when he only had to use 2 of them because he quotes from the Pasuk. So he tells you, if it's on Vayem Hashem, he'll tell you, I'm writing on Vayem Hashem. But why would he say Vayem Hashem on Moshe if he's only explaining the words Vayem Hashem? So, and Rashi is always very specific. So Rebbe is pointing out, he did his extra words because of here. And have a look at a Rashi elsewhere. And the commentaries got here, and all of a sudden, what was read to a 5-year-old to literally translate in a ladybird or style the verse, you now have an Oxford level treatise on the same pasuk using the same Rashi. He literally is the father of all academic scholarship from his time onwards. Everything is based upon him. But he doesn't just create books. Rashi creates people. His family and his students become the foundation of Ashkenazi Jewry. If Rabbeinu Gershom Marigola, who was Rashi's teacher's teacher, and Rashi considers himself to be a disciple of Rabbeinu Gershom, he sets up the framework for civil life. Rashi set up the framework for academic life within Europe. His 2 sons-in-law, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Nosson, are his partners in crime. And we had a number of his students, Rabbi Yosef ben Yehuda, Rabbi Shmaya, and so on, Rabbi Simcha Vitri, all take his teachings and help spread it around everywhere. His grandsons are the Bali Tosafos, literally the added on, and they have on the commentary on the side of the Gemara. Rashi passes away in 1095 at the same time as the First Crusade. Now, there is a story, a legend of what happened at the very end of that First Crusade. He was well done. He was only 55 years old when shoots. Yeah. Rashi was only 50. He was born in 1040. Yeah. And he passes away in 1095. He's 55 years old. No, let me just check that. Did Rashi only live for 55 years?
40.
Wow. Just when you think of it like that, when you think of what Rashi achieved, you never think, oh, well, fine, we're going to have somebody who's there. No, 1105, 10 years later. Still 65. Boom. But he finished writing his commentary. He did his Gemara by the time he was 35. By the time he was 55, he'd done his on the Chumash as well. And he passes away at the age of 65. It's amazing what the man achieved there. Now, there is a story of one of the Crusades. So who was it that was going off?
Godfrey de Bouillon.
Godfrey de Bouillon was going off on the crusade. And before he goes to Rashi's house. And he says to Rashi, will I be successful? Rashi tells him, you're going to go and you're going to defeat the Muslim conquerors of Jerusalem. It was that point. And he does. He defeats Jerusalem. He says, you will hold it for 3 days. He does. And you will then come back here and you will enter back into Worms with 3 men by your side. Well, Godfrey says, if I come back with 4 men, your head is forfeit. So Godfrey goes off. Everything transpires as he said it's supposed to. Along the way, the First Crusade destroyed the cities of Speer, Worms, and Mainz. And the Av Harachamim that we say is because, so on Shabbos, before Musa, before Ashrei, we say Av Harachamim. So in Ashkenazim, we normally only say it on the Shabbos Mishur, Shabbos Mevorachim of Sivan, because that's when it happened. In many other, we say it every single week, and we just omit it on certain weeks, but it said every week about Yinkim Nikmas Damavadecha Shafar, to avenge the spilt blood of your servants. But Godfrey de Bouillon goes to the Holy Land. They defeat the Muslims. They hold Jerusalem for 3 days. They're then kicked back out. He makes his way back, and bit by bit, as he's crossing back across Europe, all of his soldiers and his knights fall by his side. And as he's coming in to Worms, he notices he's got 4 soldiers by his side. And he remembers. And as he comes into the gate, the headstone of the gate coming in falls down and kills the soldier and the horse, or the 4th one, and he enters into the city with but 3 men by his side. He realized that he'd been trifling with a great man, and he goes along to pay his respect and asks his apologies from Rashi, and he gets there and he notices a funeral, and he's told this was Rashi's funeral, he'd come a day too late. Whether that story happened or not, I'm not saying it's got as much truth in it as Aesop's fables, but it grew a beard. It may have happened, it may not have happened. Others like to say that Rashi visited every single one of the major centers of Jewish learning in France and Germany. He never did. Some like to say that Rashi met Rambam. Rashi died in 1105. Rambam was born in 1135. So at times we have, Rambam may have really accepted Rashi's teachings. That doesn't mean the two met each other. But anyway, those are the main rabbis that we needed to look for. The one I've not mentioned this week was Rabbi Yehuda Levi, the Kuzari, because A, he's only born in 1075 and his main work is done next week, and B, we've mentioned him twice before, A, because of his Hebrew writings, and B, because of he uses the story of the Khazars, which finished last week when he writes a book, the Kuzari. That, my dear friends, is the end of this week's century.
Can I ask you one question?
Of course you can.
Rashi was giving answers to a 5-year-old. Is it in the same book as he would have given answers to you? Or is it in a different book?
I'm the 5-year-old.
So keep going.
When we say his commentary to the Chumash is written in such a manner that it helps a 5-year-old student. It's simple to the point, but it's the same words can be delved into. There's multiple layers within them. So it's just, when we say Rashi, right, and he writes that, Aini Bola Farish, I've only just come for this simple Peshat. And so, but I was saying what the Rebbe then does, what many scholars said, but the Rebbe really went to town on it, was to take the same Rashi, the same commentary, and say what can be understood by a 5-year-old can also give insights and brilliance to the age-venerable scholar. Alan, your hand went up.
Yes. What's the reference to Ashkenaz in the Bereshis? You mentioned at the beginning of your talk.
Sefer Bereshis, please. Yeah. All right. So we have it in Perek Yud Pasuk Gimel. So after the flood, the Eila told us Ben Noach, and we got the sons of Noach. His Shem, Cham, and Yafes. Yafes has a son called Gomer. Gomer Ubenei Gomer Ashkenaz. One of the names of Noach's grandsons, Yafes, great grandson, was Ashkenaz.
Right, thank you.
We do have later on also it speaks about Sephard in the Nevi'im when it speaks about the far off land. It speaks about Sephard.
Yes.
Those were names that were then adopted later on. Leslie and then David Kennedy. Leslie, David, you'll have to unmute yourself. Leslie.
Yes, I just want to ask, why were there no learned rabbis in England?
So, okay. So
Is that
number one,
particular, or there weren't enough?
no. There is a book called Chachmei Anglia, the Wise Men of England. And we often joke it's a very skinny one. The reason why they're not often referenced is twofold. Number one, the Jewish community that are living in the south of England are mainly connected with France, so they're often lumped together with Brittany, and with France, they're part of that same community. They're not seen as separate. Number two, we're there earlier, but we've got establishment from 1066. By 1290, we've been booted out.
Yeah.
So we're only there for 200 years, and most of what is done at that point, I mean, you have within York, when you've got the massive, the Rav there was a famous Bali Tosfos. I'll get his name through of who was. He actually, so you've got someone, when they all committed, it was Rabbi Yosef of Vichy, I think. So you do have them, but we're not there long enough in order to have a massive presence. And it's not until Cromwell lets us back in later on. But there were rabbis definitely living in England and a Jewish community in South England. Then you have famous halachic from once you come back in with Cromwell.
Even 1700, there's no sort of contribution by English people towards the door or anything like that, is there?
No, well, it wasn't. The main centres were mainly in Europe. There aren't. England has quite a bit of a. That's where the joke. Chachmei Anglia, the wise men of England, the rabbis of England, is a very silly book. Sorry, David was first, and then Jonathan.
Yeah. Without checking, perhaps you've checked or will check. Polygamy in Israel was still legal for many years. I think maybe 30 years after the state of Israel was formed.
And it wasn't legal. It was. It was for those that you weren't allowed to marry a second wife, and for those that came along, and that it was never legal. It was tolerated. I think is probably the word we're looking for. Tolerated.
And then in due course, it was illegal.
Yeah, and then it does become totally legal. Yes. Right. Jonathan.
I just want to thank you. It was fantastic.
Are you very, very welcome? Oh, thank you so much.
I have learned so much.
Oh, let me see if I can find.
You're saying that's for a change, are you, Johnny?
Just say again, David.
Not that all the previous ones weren't good then. Marching through the centuries.
This was
fascinating. It can't be
resistance.
Well, listen, look, I've got to give thanks to my kids for helping me out. to Rabbi Beryl Wine, to the to Simon Sharma, to the Art Scroll Historical Series, to Wikipedia, very helpful, and to 3 hours of peace and quiet to sort of collate it and put it together and write down some notes.
Right.
Very
See you again, please God, next week.
Thank you.
Please God.
I've got to thank you very much. I really enjoyed them as well.